Nick Saban's first ever quarterback room at Alabama consisted of returning starter John Parker Wilson, which next to Forrest Gump is just the most stereotypical Alabama name ever. The Tide also returned class of 2006 signing Greg McElroy, who redshirted in 2006. With Wilson and McElroy being the only two returning players in the room, Saban needed to go on and pick up some more quarterbacks. Back before picking up transfer quarterbacks was cool, the Tide went out and picked up Ross Applegate from Boston College, who, as far as I can tell, never recorded a statistic for the Eagles after playing there for one season. The Tide would also go on to sign Nick Fantasy in the class of 2007, becoming Nick Saban's first ever quarterback signee. Also, love the faucet tips there, Nick. Very 2000s of you. Wilson went on to start all 13 games for the Tide on their way to a 7-6 record. Wilson didn't exactly light the stat sheet on fire, throwing for 2,946 yards and 18 touchdowns. The 18 touchdowns was astonishingly a school record for the Tide at the time, but Wilson also did throw 12 interceptions, which caused him to undergo scrutiny from Tide fans and media alike. McElroy would serve as the backup, playing in two games, completing 8 of 9 passes for 73 yards and 1 touchdown. Fantasy would go on to only briefly appear for the Tide in 2007, playing in one game in the opener versus Western Carolina. Applegate would go on to not appear, as Wilson would hog most of the minutes for Nick Saban's quarterback room in Saban's debut season in 2007. The Tide's quarterback room would largely remain the same in 2008, with Wilson, McElroy, and Fantasy all remaining on the team. The Tide would also add four-star quarterback out of Florida, Star Jackson. It also appears that Applegate did not return to the Tide in 2008, so the Tide still remained with full scholarship quarterbacks on their roster. Not only did the quarterback room look the same, the structure of the quarterback room largely looked the same too. Wilson once again started every single game. McElroy played in 6 games as a backup. Fantasy did not appear, and Star Jackson redshirted and also did not appear. This was also a really good year for the Tide, as they came out of the gate 12-0 and eventually found themselves as the number one ranked team in the country, before dropping their final 2 games of the season to Florida and Utah. Not to take anything away from him, but Wilson really was a classic game manager, throwing for 2,273 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. The following year, in 2009, the John Parker Wilson era at Alabama was finally over. Wilson was not the only quarterback to depart from Alabama prior to the season beginning, as Nick Fantasy would transfer to Rice, where he put in a pretty solid 3-year career with ours, as he would throw for 4,402 yards, 29 touchdowns, and 19 interceptions. McElroy and Jackson would go on to stick around, and the Tide would sign A.J. McCarron, a class of 2009 in-state quarterback. McElroy and Jackson would go on to have a quarterback battle, of which McElroy would end up winning. He would go on to start every single game for the Tide on their way to a national championship, the first of Nick Saban's era. McElroy had a pretty solid season for the Tide, throwing for 2,508 yards, 17 touchdowns, and only 4 interceptions. Jackson, who served as a backup, would go on to play 5 games in mop-up duty. A.J. McCarron would redshirt, and a walk-on by the name of Thomas Duval would appear in 3 games. McElroy had the starting job very locked up, which caused Jackson to transfer following the season to Georgia State, where he never picked up much traction at all. McCarron would end up sticking around, and the Tide would add 2 quarterbacks in high school. Philip Sims, one of the highest rated quarterbacks in the country, and Blake Sims, no relation, an athlete who was given the chance to play quarterback. McElroy would go on to start every game, although the Tide would have a much more humble, by their standards, 10-3 record during the 2010 season. McElroy would get hurt late against rival Auburn, and McCarron would come on in relief, but McCarron would go 0 for 4 for passing, and the Tide would go on to lose to arch rival Auburn. Overall, as McElroy's backup, McCarron would go on to play in 9 games as a quarterback, going 30 for 48 with 389 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Both Philip and Blake Sims were redshirt. McElroy was out of eligibility, and all 3 backups were back to try and claim his job. The Tide would also sign Philip Ely in the class of 2011. The QB competition was on between McCarron and Philip Sims. This was a really close battle. Such a close battle that they were actually named co-starters prior to the season opener against Kent State. McCarron did, however, play the first snap. Against Kent State, McCarron would go 14 for 23 for 226 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Sims, on the other hand, would go 7 for 14 with 2 interceptions and 0 touchdowns. McCarron would go on to start the rest of the season on the Tide's way to yet another national championship. McCarron was, in a lot of ways, a game manager for the Tide in 2011, throwing for 2,634 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. Sims would go on to only sparingly play in 7 games the rest of the season. Blake Sims would appear in 5 games, and Ely would redshirt. On to the 2012 season, and the only departure was Philip Sims, who would transfer out to Virginia. Sims would go on to only play 1 season for Virginia, primarily serving as a backup and throwing for 1,263 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. The Tide would make one addition, signing Alec Morris in the class of 2012. McCarron would once again go on to start every single game for the Tide. The Tide would once again win a national championship. This is also the year where McCarron completely destroyed that quote-unquote game manager tag, as he threw for 2,933 yards, 30 touchdowns, and just 3 interceptions. McCarron was even named a third-team All-American following the season. Beyond McCarron, Alabama's backup quarterbacks only played sparingly. Blake Sims served as the backup, playing in 10 games. Philip Ely only played in 6 games, and Alec Morris redshirted. The following year, the only loss to the quarterback room was Ely, who transferred out to Toledo. Ely actually put together a pretty respectable career at Toledo, especially in his 2015 season, where he threw for 2,965 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. Alabama would sign 2 quarterbacks in the class of 2013. Cooper Bateman, a highly touted quarterback out of the Salt Lake City area, and Parker McLeod, a quarterback out of the greater Atlanta area. McCarron was once again back for another year. This quarterback room was his, and he once again proved that by starting every single game on the season. Not only did McCarron start every game, he looked damn good doing it, throwing for 3,063 yards, 28 touchdowns, and finishing second in the Heisman Trophy, only to Jameis Winston. On top of this, McCarron was a first-team All-American, the Maxwell Award winner, and the Johnny Unitas Golden Arm Award winner. I know I referred to McCarron as a game manager earlier in the video in reference to his 2011 season, but McCarron turned into so much more than just this. Before Tua started lighting it up at Bama, people like to act like that every quarterback under Nick Saban at Alabama was some game manager. And sure, some of them I understand getting this title, but McCarron, based off his acolytes and his high level of play, makes no sense getting the game manager tag. Beyond McCarron, there was not much play for Alabama quarterbacks. Blake Sims did, however, play in 13 games as a backup, but Alec Morris, Cooper Bateman, Parker McLeod all failed to see the field. It was the ending of an era for the Tide, as for the first time in 3 seasons they were going to be looking for a new quarterback, as McCarron was out of eligibility. Oh yeah, and it was also the ending of another era, as Parker McLeod transferred out following the season after playing a grand total of 0 snaps. Parker McLeod, you are an Alabama legend. The Tide would retain the rest of their quarterbacks, and they'd also bring 2 new ones in, as they signed David Cornwell out of high school, and they'd also bring in Jake Coker, a transfer from Florida State, which was pretty notable. Coker, an Alabama native who had spent the last season as the backup under national championship and Heisman Trophy winning quarterback Jameis Winston, was expected by many to come in and be the Tide starter for the 2014 season. Still, the Tide had Bateman, Morris, and most notably Sims still on the roster, and they all had a couple years of experience in the system on Coker, so Coker wasn't just going to walk on in and take the starting quarterback job. The QB battle came down to Coker and Sims, and in a bit of an upset, Sims wound up being named the starting quarterback for the season opener for the 2014 Alabama team. Sims would go on to start all 14 games for Alabama and put up some pretty good numbers, throwing for 3,487 yards with 28 touchdowns. Sims would also rush for an additional 350 yards and 7 touchdowns. Blake Sims is a guy who didn't even start until his 5th year in the program and had gone through a little bit of a position controversy, with him at one point playing running back, and there being a lot of questioning about where he plays and what his true position is. On top of that, a transfer quarterback being in to specifically challenge him in his final year on the program. Sims had every reason to quit, to give up, but he didn't, and he showed a lot of loyalty and dedication. I think Blake Sims should be admired for that. Following the season, Sims was out of eligibility, and he would be the sole quarterback to lead the Alabama room. Coker saw action in 5 games as Sims' backup. Morris would play in 4 games as the third-string quarterback, and Bateman would serve as the team holder while Cornwell would redshirt. These guys were all back, and the Tide would also bring in Blake Barnett, a class of 2015 signee, who was a highly touted quarterback that had initially been committed to Notre Dame. To put it bluntly, this job was Jake Coker's to lose. Bateman reportedly made a run at Coker, but Coker did end up starting the first 2 games of the season for the Tide. In his first 2 starts, Coker didn't exactly light the world on fire, going 15 of 21 for 213 yards and 1 touchdown against Wisconsin, and going 15 for 26 for 214 yards, 1 touchdown and 1 interception against Middle Tennessee State. This QB controversy was far from over, and Bateman would actually start the Week 3 game against Ole Miss, reportedly due to Coker having attitude issues. Bateman would go 11 for 14 for 87 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Coco would end up replacing him midway through the second quarter. Coco would go on to go 21 of 45 for 201 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, and the Tide would lose to the Rebels. This would end up being the only game the Tide would lose on the season. It would also be the only game that Coco wouldn't start on the season, as Coco would start the rest of the season, and the Tide would go on to win yet another national championship. Coco would wind up having a pretty solid season for himself, throwing for 3,110 yards, 21 touchdowns, and just 8 interceptions. Bateman would finish the season as their backup, throwing for 291 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Coco and Bateman had the quarterback playing time market cornered at Alabama. Morris were only playing 3 games as the third stringer, Barnett would redshirt, and Cornwell would not see any game action at quarterback. Following the season, Coco and Morris were the only 2 quarterbacks for Alabama to lose, as Coco would run out of eligibility and Morris would transfer out to North Texas. The only addition they would make is some guy named Jalen Hurts, who they signed in the class of 2016. Up to this point, this was definitely Nick Saban's most wide-open quarterback battle he had at Alabama. None of the guys were really proven. Those 4 guys between Cornwell, Barnett, Hurts, and Bateman that were all in the thick of the competition. Barnett would emerge victorious, at least so it seemed, as he'd be the starting quarterback in the season opener against USC. Barnett put up respectable numbers, going 5 of 6 for 100 yards, 1 touchdown, and 0 interceptions. However, this was short-lived as Hurts would take over midway through the game. Hurts would go on to start every game the rest of the season. Hurts put up really good numbers for being a true freshman quarterback playing against such a high level of competition, throwing for 2,780 yards, 23 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. Hurts would also add another element on the ground, rushing for 954 yards and 13 touchdowns. Barnett would end up transferring a week later after losing the job to Hurts. There's dozens of videos on YouTube that explain what happened to Barnett following his Alabama career, so if you're curious as to what happened to Blake Barnett, go give him a check out. Bateman will return to his post as the backup quarterback for the Tide, and Cornwell would play in 1 game on the year, handing the ball off against Mississippi State. Jalen Hurts really blew up this quarterback room, as not only did Barnett transfer, but Bateman would transfer out to Utah as a walk-on, and Cornwell would transfer out to Nevada. Heading into the 2017 season, the Tide would need to get some depth behind Jalen Hurts, and they did a pretty good job doing that. They would go on to sign 2 high school quarterbacks in the class of 2017, one named Tua Tagovailoa, the other one named Mac Jones. This all seemed pretty cut and dry, and it truly was. This was Hurts' job, and he started every single game on the season, including the national title game against Georgia. But that game, things kind of started to change. Jalen Hurts and the Tide were struggling against the Bulldogs. By halftime, Hurts was just 3 of 8 for 21 yards, and the Tide were down 13-0. This is when Saban would decide to pivot to Tagovailoa, and Tagovailoa would end up leading the Tide to a victory in overtime, throwing a game-winning touchdown pass to Devontae Smith for the Tide to claim yet another national championship. Suddenly, there was a QB controversy in Tide Town, and all 3 quarterbacks from the previous year would return for the Tide. The Tide would also add Lane Hatcher, a 3-star quarterback in the class of 2018. This was a really tight quarterback battle, one of which Tagovailoa would emerge victorious, as he'd start the season opener against Louisville and was officially named the starter the following week against Arkansas State. Still, despite being the backup and Tagovailoa lighting college football up, Hurts wasn't a forgotten commodity, as he was using special packages throughout the season, and his time to shine came in the SEC championship game against the Georgia Bulldogs. Midway through the game, Tagovailoa had gone down with an injury, and Hurts had come in and led a come-from-behind victory against the Bulldogs to claim an SEC championship win and to cement himself as a Bama legend. Tagovailoa would return in time for the playoffs, which would result in a national championship game loss against the Trevor Lawrence-led Clemson Tigers. Despite some late-season heroics from Jalen Hurts, this was still Tua Tagovailoa's job, and Hurts knew that. Hurts would transfer to Oklahoma following the season, and I guess you can say the rest is history. The Tide would also lose Hatcher to transfer after only 1 season, as he'd head over to Arkansas State, but Jones would return. The Tide would also add 2 high school quarterbacks in the class of 2019 that had connections to them, Talia Tagovailoa, the younger brother of Tua, and Paul Tyson, a grandson of legendary head coach Bear Bryant. Tua was once again really good for the Tide. However, he really struggled with injuries throughout the year. He started and played in 9 games, but missed the rest due to injuries. Mac Jones, Tua's backup, would wind up starting 4 games, including most of which at the tail ending of the season after Tua went down with a season-ending injury. Jones would throw for 1,503 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Beyond Jones and Tua, Talia would play in 5 games as the third-string quarterback, and Paul Tyson would only appear in 1 game versus Western Carolina while preserving his red shirt. The Tagovailoa era was over at Alabama, as Tua would declare for the NFL draft following the season, and Talia would elect to transfer to Maryland. Jones and Tyson were back for the 2020 season. The Tide would also add a superstar quarterback in the class of 2020 in Bryce Young. It was believed that Young would challenge Jones for the starting quarterback job, but ultimately Jones was named the starter, and Jones would go on to start all 13 games for the Tide on the way to once again another national championship. Jones lit college football up too, as he threw for 4,500 yards, 41 touchdowns, and just 4 interceptions. He would also go on to finish third in the Heisman Trophy voting, with his wide receiver and teammate Devontae Smith taking home the award. Young served as the backup, playing in 7 games, and Tyson did not see any game action. Jones declared for the NFL draft following the season, where he'd get drafted in the first round by the New England Patriots. But it was clear the Bryce Young era was beginning for the Tide. The only addition to the quarterback room was class of 2021 signee Jalen Milroe. Bryce Young was the clear starter from the very beginning of the 2021 season. He'd go on to start all 15 games, throwing for 4,872 yards, 47 touchdowns, all on his way to winning the Heisman Trophy. Tyson served as the backup, playing in 12 games, while Milroe would play in 4 games, the maximum amount allowed to preserve a redshirt. 2021 was a pretty cut and dry year for the quarterback room at Alabama. They'd only lose one player out of that room, as Paul Tyson would transfer to Arizona State prior to the 2022 season. Only one addition would be made to the quarterback room, as Ty Simpson would sign in the class of 2022 out of high school. Young was obviously the clear starter coming into this season, but he would struggle with injuries a little bit throughout the year. Miller would actually start an early season game against Texas A&M after Young went down with an injury in the previous week. Miller would lead the Tide to a 24-20 victory, but he would also record 3 turnovers while also recording 3 touchdowns. The rest of the season was pretty simple for the Tide at quarterback. Young started the rest of the games and did not struggle with injuries. Miller did play in 8 total games, including the start against Texas A&M, which is his sole start in the season. Simpson would go on to play in 4 games while preserving his red shirt. Young would declare for the NFL draft the following season, where he'd end up being the number 1 overall pick, but the Tide yet again had a little bit of an unknown at quarterback. And what would eventually prove to be Nick Saban's last year as the head coach at Alabama, Miller and Simpson would return. The Tide would also sign quarterbacks Eli Holstein and Dylan Lonergan out of high school in the class of 2023, and add transfer quarterback Tyler Buchner, who was the starting quarterback at Notre Dame for a lot of the previous season. Miller, Simpson, and Buchner would all compete for the starting job, as Miller would eventually emerge victorious, as he would start Week 1 against Middle Tennessee State. Miller would account for 5 total touchdowns in the first game of the season, but the following week was a little bit more disappointing, as the Tide would lose to Texas, and Miller would only account for 2 touchdowns and have 2 interceptions in the game. For relatively unknown reasons, Buchner would go on to start the next game against USF, and it wasn't the best performance from Buchner or the Tide. They did, however, go on to win, but Miller would go on to start the rest of the season, starting 13 of 13 games played in. Miller overall had a really solid season for the Tide, throwing for 2,834 yards, 23 touchdowns, and just 6 interceptions, and he also added 531 yards and 12 touchdowns on the ground. Beyond Miller, Buchner would appear in 2 games for the Tide, including the start against South Florida. Simpson would play in 4 games, Lonergan 1 game, and Holstein with a redshirt. Holstein and Buchner would enter the transfer portal following the season. Most importantly, following the season, Nick Saban would enter the transfer portal, where he would eventually commit to the Tuscaloosa retirement home. I don't think there's any debate that Nick Saban's the greatest college football coach ever, and it's kind of amazing to see how his quarterbacks developed through Alabama, and the ways he won with so many different kinds of quarterbacks with so many different kinds of skill sets. I mean, his first quarterback in John Parker Wilson and his last quarterback in Jalen Milroe could not have been more different. And he won so many games with star quarterbacks like Bryce Young and Tua Tagovailoa, but also won games with guys that were kind of game managers like Jake Coker and Greg McElroy. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble for the last 20 minutes, and please like and sub for more.